a little conversation yesterday, so that was nice to get warmed up a little bit. So I just finished reading your book today and went through it, didn't want to mark it up, so it would be nice and pristine for the next person who wants to read it. But thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for coming to talk to me.
So parenting in a climate crisis, which is a little bit of a tongue twister, you say get involved and be specific. You have to feel what's going on. So Climate Crisis 101. So what is a climate crisis and how do we define weather?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important term to start with. So weather is kind of what we think of happening every day outside versus the climate is what's happening over time in a specific area or region.
Okay. And then the climate change is the climate crisis, how the climate has changed over a period of time.
Right. So we know that the climate is getting significantly warmer, and that's leading to all sorts of changes. The one that I think is most noticeable for most people is the increase in extreme weather, such as the wildfires that happened out in LA or the flooding in North Carolina last year.
And it's happening more and more, and the storms are getting more horrific.
Right.
And more problematic.
Right. And that's something that will continue for the foreseeable future.
Oh boy. And we know that it's a climate change because of scientific research and data collection. How long has this data collection been going on?
Yeah, so we know back in 1959 was probably the first kind of alarm bells that went off about what was happening, but scientists actually kind of theorized that this would happen back in the 1800s. So we've known for a very long time.
So we have known for a very long time. And in your book, you talk about the first climatologist, and that was Eunice Newton Foote. And why was she significant?
So she was the first person that really kind of theorized what would happen if we were burning fossil fuels, that it could create this greenhouse effect where the planet warms up. A lot of people didn't know what to make of her work back then, especially as a woman in the 1800s, but it was really built upon and is what we think of as climate science today.
Okay. And then we talk about greenhouse gases. What do we specifically mean? Is it carbon dioxide and ozone?
Yeah, so carbon dioxide is sort of the big one, and that's, I think, what the majority of people think about, and it's started to become an interchangeable word where people will say carbon emissions, but there's also methane emissions are also very important, especially when you're talking from an agricultural or food production standpoint. And then, there's also even water vapor is considered a greenhouse gas.
And what is water vapor? What does that mean?
So one of the things that I think probably people think about it the most is when Bezos started launching his spaceship, he was saying it was carbon neutral because it was running on water vapor or emitting water vapor. That's not really true because we still consider that to be a gas that can warm the planet.
And this is all caused by burning fossil fuels. And what do we mean by fossil fuels specifically?
Right, so we mean like your oil and your gas productions, coal, even some people would consider it like wood stove burning, especially in certain countries where there's more of that than we would necessarily see here.
Okay. So 60 years ago we got a warning, and then what happened? What happened when we got the warning? Did we all say, let's figure this out and let's go together? What happened?
It's interesting because there was this brief moment of time in the 60s and 70s when fossil fuel industries actually kind of said to each other, we should knock this off, we should stop this. And then that very quickly went in the other direction because money is such a motivating factor. And it is kind of interesting. One thing that came out this past week was that beef production companies have also known for a very long time what their emissions were. So when we think of beef, we're thinking about methane emissions more, which is a lot more potent than carbon dioxide, but doesn't stick around in the atmosphere for quite as long. But we're just starting to learn how long they knew about what they were doing and the consequences of it too.
So the energy companies continue to invest in fossil fuels and denied and delayed any climate action.
Yeah,
that-
I mean, they embarked on an incredible marketing campaign. When we think about carbon footprint and personal carbon footprint, that was really a tool of the fossil fuel companies to put the blame on individuals instead of themselves.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting in your book when you wrote about that, talking like the problem, according to the energy companies, the problem's us, not them. And we all have our foot in the water, right, or in the story, but they're really the big.
Right, and you see it like continuing today when you think of like, say, recycling, right? Like the problem isn't that like you're not recycling your plastic water bottle. The problem is that those companies keep putting out plastic water bottles when they could put them in a different type of container.
Interesting, yeah. So I like it in your book how you broke it up according to ages, because we don't want to scare the little ones, but we want them to hug the trees and appreciate and love the earth. So you said share what's developmentally appropriate. So if you're under 4, if you have a 4-year-old or younger, what do you say for them?
Yeah, so the younger your kid is, the more you're kind of like setting the foundation. And so that's a lot more thinking about like, oh, you pick up when you're outside and you're having a picnic, just like you would pick up your toys in the house. And that's like starting to kind of teach this environmental responsibility. And then as you can get older, it progresses a lot. I think when kids start to get into elementary school, a lot of parents like to use the example of like a blanket to understand climate change, because that's something that you can even do at home, right? Like you wrap your kid in a blanket and they get warmer. You add more blankets on top and they get warmer and warmer, and then you take it off. So like that is a very great way to start teaching like younger kids about what we mean when we say climate change.
Oh, I love that. And then what about the 14 to 17-year-old? What do we do for them?
Yeah, so the older your kid is, the more aware they already are of what's happening. And so that is a lot of thinking about like how you can let them lead, like what are they passionate about, and what do they want to take on, while also kind of monitoring their media consumption to make sure that it's not too much.
But I always continue the conversation, right? I always continue the conversation with the child and connect with other parents if possible.
Right. So I think one of the things in my research that I didn't really like, but that experts kept coming back to, was that we need to talk about the climate crisis and what's happening more with our friends and our neighbors and just other parents at school. And that was something, especially as an introvert, that I just did not like the idea of, but is so important in the sense of the more we talk about it and the more we make it an everyday occurrence, the more progress can happen.
Well, there still is a certain part of the population that probably considers climate crisis a myth, right?
I think that is a very small amount now. We know that more than 70% of Americans are concerned about the climate crisis. And we even know that a majority of Americans are in support of some sort of climate action, especially around clean energy. And that those are polls that have come out very recently as the Trump administration dismantles the EPA. There's been a lot of pushback for that.
Okay. So I think it's really important. You wrote in your book, you said, I care because. So not just that you care, but what is the reason behind it, and why should we become involved? What is the action?
Well, I mean, I think we care because we live on this planet, right? That's the simplest part. But I think the action is really thinking about, well, what is it that you care about the most? Maybe it's like the coastline where you live, or maybe, I think for a lot of children, it comes from animals. One of the kids I spoke to in my book, Cash Daniels, first kind of got involved in climate activism because he was concerned about manatees and sea turtles while he was on vacation. And from that, he organized river cleanups.
And that was an amazing story.
Yeah. He's a very cool kid. It's been, the book was kind of 4 years of research, so it's been really interesting to kind of like watch him grow up as I've been like checking back in.
Oh, that's really nice. I love that. So talking brings thoughts into light. I like that. And he said 70% of Americans think climate crisis and that we are dangers. And there's some organization, Parents for Futures. So it's a systemic, not an individual.
Right. So Parents for Futures came about from Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Futures. And so it was kind of like the parental offshoot of that. It's significantly bigger in Europe than it is here in the US. The UK domination is a lot bigger, and they'll organize their own protests.
So we need to make it personal. So how do we do that? We poll our friends. We try to cook more vegetarian meals. What are some of the things that we can do?
So I think we tend to forget that it can be very simple. You know, it's like everyday problems that you have when your kids are just babies, right? You're thinking about like what type of diapers to use. And so it can be something simple as, well, I couldn't handle cloth diapering, but I'm using this brand of diapers because they biodegrade quicker, they're not going to end up in a landfill emitting methane gas. Like, it can be very simple and everyday things.
Okay. And that's how you start. When we start to act, hope is everywhere. That was one of the quotes that I got out of your book, so I thought that was a really good. So, but then you talked about climate grief. What do you mean by climate grief?
Yeah, so I think it can be really overwhelming, especially when we see like the news of the fires out in LA, for instance. I think people can feel all sorts of emotions that you would kind of associate more with the loss of a loved one almost, right? Like anger and denial. And so I think that is a big thing for parents to consider, especially as their kids become more aware of what's happening.
Absolutely. And I really liked it in your book how you talked about being outside is good in different seasons, and it forces the brain development in different ways. So actually just being out in fresh air, by water, on...
Yeah, I mean, even just, 5 minutes a day can be life-changing, really, and really help with all sorts of developmental skills.
That's really impactful. Every time a child is outside, he learns something new. And you were saying that outdoor classes should happen more often. So how do we help to promote something like that?
So it's interesting. The state of Maine now offers elementary schools that are nature-based, and so they're spending the majority of their time outside. So things are starting to happen on the state level. Out in Colorado, they passed a bill last year to kind of make nature preschools more affordable for parents so that they could attract a wider population.
I love that.
And then I know here in Groton, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but a few years ago they had a hiking club where they would take the kids out of school one day in the afternoons and they would go for a longer hike.
Well, you learn so much, and it's so good for the body and the whole process. And then there's a Living Schoolyards Act. What is that all about?
So the Living Schoolyards Act has been introduced in Congress the past 2 years, maybe 3 years if it gets reintroduced. And the idea behind this is that it would give states money to kind of expand their outdoor classrooms in different ways. Sometimes it could be like a garden, sometimes it's real classrooms, sometimes it's rethinking the way playgrounds are designed to make them more nature-based, or even just as the temperature changes, a lot of our playgrounds are blacktop, right? So they heat up really quickly, or swings and slides are all designed of things that are also getting really hot really quickly. And so it might be planting trees in specific areas or swapping out building materials.
Having more shade. I know in Australia they have a lot more shaded area for the kids to play because their sun is so intense.
And then the trees can also be like their own playscape in a sense, kids can climb them. It's all sorts of risk building.
Very good. And if we spend time with a tree, what happens? You've talked a lot about trees.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information from Japan about all the benefits of spending time with trees. And it can actually reduce your heart rate, it reduces stress. There's some developing research that says it can even change the makeup of your brain.
That's amazing. And there's people who are studying this, and they say this is actually true.
Yeah, and so the country of Japan actually has been studying this since the 1980s, and so they have all sorts of forest bathing is what they call it, like activities and even parks where people can go to.
That's really smart. I love that. So curiosity, and you said that people become deeper thinkers by being outside more.
Well, I think that being outside more is one way to nurture curiosity because there's so many things that like you can see or experience, right? Even something as simple as, it's raining at the bus stop. You can drop a stick in the water if it's running down the side of the road and see what happens to it. Or you can jump in a puddle and see what happens. Or you can measure a puddle.
Right. Well, and it's just cause and effect. It's all those STEM things that we wanted, the
Right.
curiosity. Why did that happen? How did that happen? What did you observe? Paying attention to that, having a conversation about it. So
It's more fun when you're...
and you're having fun, yeah, or even just splashing, having a splash party with your boots on. So curiosity, why can't we ban fossil fuels? Why can't we make airplanes run on renewable energy? And why can't I reduce my household food waste? Those are some whys, right? So teaching, they say you really can't teach curiosity. So how do we
Right.
create it so they're like, why? Because I know that's a 3-year-old thing, right?
Right. So, I mean, most little kids are asking why all the time. And then we actually see that drops off significantly as soon as kids enter some sort of standardized education program. Normally, even in kindergarten and first grade, it goes way down.
So then they're saying, will it be on the test?
Right. And it's just like part of going to school is learning how to behave, right? You got to stand in line, you got to take turns, so there's less time for asking all of those why questions. But one of the things that like we can do when there is time is to really like take the time to explore those
Well, and
questions.
I've always said that parents are the child's first educators, the parents and the grandparents, those first initial caregivers.
Right.
So, okay, so I love that. So, and I love it how you said curiosity requires failure. So you have to maybe get your boot in the puddle and then get water into your shoe, and then it's just like, oh, I didn't think that would happen, or you're stepping on a piece of ice, and
Right.
yeah.
And sometimes it requires making a mess. Yeah.
And you have to be okay with that. And it requires resilience, and then resilience requires curiosity. So if you're going to continue to persist in an activity, you have to be like, I wonder if I can figure this out, right? I wonder,
Right.
That's really interesting.
Right.
It's kind of like all that brain work. And then you talked about benign neglect. What do you mean by that? And why is that important?
So this was a term that a parenting writer coined in a article for Romper several years ago, and she was kind of like, look, I'm like working from home full time, and I have to be able to work, so if my kid is doing something on the floor, like she's going to figure it out, right? Sometimes it's being okay with kids being like, well, I'm bored, and then letting them figure something out. My daughter today stayed home from school because she was sick, and at one point she was just cutting up little scraps of paper on the side of the room. It's like, okay, like that's what you're doing.
Sure. How old is she now?
She's 6.
So then she could take and make a tile mosaic out of it with paper
Right.
tiles, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So using that. So aviation, this was really interesting. So aviation contributes to 2% of the overall global emissions. So how can we be better travelers, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that planes are sometimes an easy person to blame, or industry to blame, but it is a kind of a small percentage right now. And I think that's like, I try to limit the amount of flights that I take, but I also think it's probably more impactful if we could get Congress to pass laws that would tax people with private planes more than they currently do. Or, the country of France has limited flights that are less than, I think, 2 hours when there is like high-speed rail in between those. We don't really have the same rail network that they do, but those are all like possibilities.
And I really think it would be nice if we had more public transportation, and our transportation concerns in this country are pretty significant.
Right.
Yeah. So we're always building on problem solving and being resource conscious. So how can we increase some of that activity? Opt for public transportation if we're going into New York or up to Boston. Maybe take the train.
Right, yeah. I think definitely to be able to take the train, or just, to think about different ways of getting different things or getting to different places.
Okay. So we're trying to raise resilient children, and how do we handle the diversity? How do we handle different things that we want them to do and to experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's going to be a question that really depends on where you are, right? For us here, it's easier to get outside than it is if you're in New York City. But there's always different experiences or perks that you can get to, and different things to see.
Okay, so you're saying that we should try to reduce the amount of meat, possibly. Maybe have one day a week where we don't have meat, or like, I don't know, Meatless Monday, I think some people call it sometimes.
Right. Yeah, I think, reducing, the carbon footprint of your food is something that's very easy for most people to do, and it could be reducing the amount of meat you're eating or the amount of processed foods you're eating. Or really even just food waste tends to be a huge contributor to emissions.
And by that, you're talking about people not composting, that you'd like to see people doing that more?
Right, or even just, I think we waste a lot of food in the United States, just that we end up throwing out that was still edible for whatever reason. A lot of it happens on the farm level, but a lot of it also happens in our own homes.
So being more careful of that. And I think it's always interesting when we talk about where is your food from, and why is it important for children to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that where your food is from kind of opens up all sorts of different questions and problems. You can start to think about, well, who has access to different types of food, who's making the food, how is it being made? And so starting with, like, where is your food coming from is sort of a jumping off point.
And then we have to read those labels.
Right.
And how do we even know what those labels mean? I mean, I think that would be like a whole nother class or a whole nother,
yeah.
But you're good at that, right?
So I think that, I mean, you can't do it every time you're at the supermarket, but if there's ever like a rainy day and your kids are really bored, you can almost just go to the supermarket and be like, well, let's find, how many organic produce there is, and like, what does that actually mean? Or let's see if we can find applesauce that is not in a plastic container, and why do we not want it to be in a plastic container?
There's just so much. And then what about the places that we shop, the farmers markets, buying fresh things if we can?
Yeah, I mean, I think, not everybody has access to farmers markets, but when you can, that's a great place to be able to meet your farmer, and learn ask them how they're growing their food.
Oh, absolutely. And just to see it, and to see things go from seed to plant to product to vegetable, or and I like the idea of a trash audit. What did you mean by that? Like a trash audit?
Yeah, so a friend of mine had actually kind of suggested this, and it's something that she has done before, where you probably want like some rubber gloves and some newspaper or something down on their floor, but to really go through your trash and then be like, well, what could we have done differently, right?
Interesting.
Like, could we have bought a bigger yogurt container instead of throwing out these little tiny yogurt containers?
My husband makes our yogurt at our house, so we're really lucky. Right. He starts out with a pretty big gallon of milk, and
then you don't even need that. And then I think like you can start with food, but then it can apply to all sorts of other trash in your house, right? And also the way we purchase and discard of all different things.
It'd be really eye-opening, I think, to try to do that. And I love the idea, use what we have night. So maybe one night a week, just saying, try to plan your meals, because if you're more planning and planful in the meals that you have, then there's probably less wastage. But also if you have a night where you're like, let's just see what we have and come up with a really kind of fun meal.
Right, yeah, and I think especially, like, it's helpful if you make it like one set day a week so that you always know that it's happening, and maybe it's like kind of towards the end of whenever you normally do your supermarket shopping.
So you also suggest that there's some consumerism shifts that we could do. So 6 significant shifts. One was to eat more plant-based diet. So I guess that would be more beans and rice and vegetables, things like that. Okay. And then buy no more than 3 items of clothing a year.
Yeah, that seems like a hard one to do.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, that's also new clothing, right? There's thrift shopping has become popular again, so there's a lot of that that's happening. I know a lot of places do clothing swaps. But yeah, that seems like, especially with kids, that's the harder thing to be able to do.
I think there's some things like socks that maybe you need.
Right.
I don't know, but yeah. So, and then keep electronics for
about 7 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is the life expectancy, do we think, of most electronics?
I don't know. I will say I just bought a new iPad, and the other one was 10 plus years old, so it is possible to keep them.
Well, and yeah, you run out of memory, and then if it's not updated, you know,
Right,
that's
eventually.
planned obsolescence
Yeah.
too that we have to deal with on the manufacturer's part, because they want us to
Right.
keep consuming.
Right.
So it's kind of a catch-22.
Yeah.
Right. Keep your car as long as possible.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have an electric vehicle, and it's fairly new, but I had needed to buy a new car. If you can keep your car for as long as possible, that's going to be the lowest carbon emitter.
Okay. And then shift to nudge the system was the last thing. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's thinking about things like changing up your power supply or asking like your kids' school to change up their power supply, things that are kind of moving us more away from fossil fuels on a larger level.
Okay. I love the story where you talk about going to the beach with your daughter and you have 3 buckets. Would you like to share about that?
Yeah, so we take a lot of walks at Napa Tree here, and we always brought a bucket at first just to collect seashells, and then we started noticing how much bits of plastic we were finding. So we started getting, another container just to collect that so we could throw away at the end. But we also have a compost at home, and seaweed is great for compost. So now we have a bucket for compost.
So
Yeah.
you're heavily armed. Yeah. And I really liked the part about the B Corporation certified companies, that you really try to support those.
Yeah, so your B certified companies are kind of companies that have gone a step above in terms of thinking about their environmental impact, but also their labor and how they're treating people. So that is something when I'm looking for new clothing, for instance, I try to find B certified companies.
Patagonia, Allbirds, Ben & Jerry, Bombas, Cabot Creamery, The Body Shop, Alter Eco, Athleta, Coursera, Eileen Fisher, Natura, and Tom's.
Yeah, I think so. Alter Eco actually has chocolate that they make in compostable wrappers that I have found is great, especially when you need Halloween candy or piñata candy.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So we talked about, in your book, you talked about STEM and STEAM and using kind of like the Montessori method with instruction, just getting kids to be very curious and exploring and experiencing, and then having conversations about that, and then coming away from that and having some analysis, and then synthesizing it, and then coming up with some real good, deep understanding. And I thought this was really interesting when you talk about food at school lunches, and we try to keep it down to, you said $1.60 in your book, but I think that's a few years old, because I think...
So that was a New York City thing, and actually now New York City does free lunches, so I'm not sure what they're trying to keep it down to, but that was a project at a high school in New York City.
And I thought that was so interesting that the kids were supposed to try to get 5 different food groups, and then talk about people who had food insecurity, and then the inequity that comes with food, the resources. We've talked a lot about that.
Right. So one of the things that I thought was interesting when I was doing my research into education was, as a lot more schools have focused on stem cells, they've often picked a discipline to focus the entire school around. So in Georgia, for instance, a lot of the schools were focusing on healthcare, and the classes were kind of be built around that. In New York City, the example that you're talking about, it was a school that was all about food sciences. So they had an indoor hydroponic garden.
Nice.
And so then they were doing all of these other things from meal planning on that kind of affected all of their classes.
Well, and I think it's really interesting with the STEM teaching and this method of instruction. There's no one right answer. So you have to always evaluate, like, this is more true or better than this, and it's all relative to something else. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that that's something that people need to feel comfortable with, right? Because I think sometimes people just want, is it yes or is it no?
Right, when we get very set on there having to be one right answer.
Exactly. So, but then STEM instruction also increases creativity and problem solving, and then teamwork too, because you have to work with other people to find out.
Right, yeah.
So you talked a little bit about schools and fossil fuels. Schools and fossil fuels. In page 145 of the book, I want to pull that out. You said, children alive today could see entire ecosystems collapse within their lifetimes. That's pretty startling.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of climate scientists would tell you that probably the first thing to go will be the coral reef system, and that is going to take a lot of marine animals with that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just kind of takes your breath away when you think about it. So if we start to get schools to think about these different experiences that the kids are going to have taken away from them, extracted from them, that's going to be pretty significant. So if we're looking at school boards and habitats for pollinators, more things on the playground, little greenhouses so the kids can see some of the process of the food and that they eat it, and then also gardens. What else do you think along that line?
So a lot of schools have focused on renewable energy. So in Alaska, they've also actually done a lot with wind power and some hydropower, but a lot of wind power. And Alaska is not normally a state that you think of as leading in climate actions. It's a very red state, but energy is really expensive in Alaska. And so they've been able to come at it from this issue of, well, it is so expensive. How can we make it less expensive? And how can we also teach kids about energy and where it comes from and what they're paying for?
So it's just so important, everything, every little aspect of it. I think we pretty much went through a lot of the book. I love your talk and call for activism and no child left inside rather than no child left behind, but no child left inside. So if we get out and see the world, experience it, enjoy it, take care of it, then we'll start to take care of it a little bit better, hopefully.
Right. I think you have to fall in love with it first.
Oh, I love that. That's really sweet. So is there some points that I didn't cover in the book that you think would like to?
No, I don't think so. I think we can let anybody ask questions if they have any questions.
Is there anybody who would like to? Oh, we do have a hand in the air, and we have a microphone. So would you like to share your name?
I don't need a microphone.
It'll be on the recording though, so
right.
that's why.
One here too.
Oh, good. Right here behind you.
I have one right here in my hand.
Oh.
Thank you. Hi, Bridget.
Hi, Bridget.
Once you left Groton, how did you get so involved with climate change?
So I really started as kind of a food systems reporter for a nonprofit food publication that was based out in California. And so when you're thinking about food from the point of view of farmers and chefs and the ingredients that they love and how they might not be able to get them was kind of how I fell into thinking about environmental issues.
Well, in California too, I just had an interview with Narcisse Green at Eastside High School, and she's been working on the food composting program that we have that was just initiated this January, so just a couple months ago, and kind of the impact that is having, and how in Northern California, where she's from, it was mandated by law that everybody do it. So I think we're starting to see some.
Right, Vermont does that as well, where you have to recycle your food scraps.
Yeah. Or get to.
Right.
Any other questions?
I just want to point out that the Groton, as far as I know, Groton Kids get outside the Groton Public Schools and Avalonia Land Trust. They take the kids, they still are taking them out on hikes, and they go to the sheep farm, and they do a lot of the local hikes and get
Yeah,
them
I wasn't sure if that was
in
still
touch.
happening,
Yes,
but I knew it had
still
been.
happening.
Yeah.
It's still happening, and the earlier you start, the better it is. So.
Absolutely.
Thank
I
you.
think the more you experience, and I love the point in your book when you talk about the value of animals and how animals teach children so much, whether it's having a pet or going to a zoo. My granddaughter has some pretty significant allergies, so they don't have any pets, but every time they go to the book barn, she gets little carrots, I guess, and there's 3 goats, and she tries to make sure all 3 of the goats get an equal amount of the carrots, right? So, I love your thing about, is there another question? I loved your thing about like the sharing of clothes, the swapping of clothes. In East Lyme, where I live, we have a Buy Nothing group. You probably have one.
Right, yeah.
And my friend and I are doing a program up in Griswold, and I needed some clipboards. And rather, like I looked, and I'm trying to not do anything on Amazon. So, in certain stores, I'm trying to not shop at. So then I was like, I wonder if anybody in my Buy Nothing group would have some clipboards that I could bring so that when I go up there,
Right, you have them, yeah.
rather than just buying, right?
Right, and then they're just sitting somewhere that you're not going to be using again.
Exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
to your point. Rich, do you have a question? No? Anybody else have any questions? Is there anything that you'd like to share, Brie? Other than it took you 4 years to write this book?
Well, the writing itself was pretty quick. It was more the like research.
Well, and I was really impressed, and I hope all of you buy it because it really is very resourceful and has good ideas for things that you can do. But the additional reading, the books at the back, all the other things that we can read, online resources, and all of your references for you did a lot of work, hours and hours, endless, countless hours.
It was a lot of work and a lot of double checking everything afterwards. And then like some things of course changed over the course of it.
I did not look, but it was it published 2025, so this is brand new. When did it hit the press?
Last month. It's been exactly a month.
Congratulations! That's lovely. Is this your first book or
It's
second?
my
Your
first book, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, kudos to you. I think that's terrific.
Thank
And what's
you.
your next book going to be on?
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure something will start to percolate. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much. I feel smarter after reading the book, having the interview, having in-depth conversation, and I think I'm inspired. I hope everybody else is too. Yes, I see nods. So you've already changed lives and you're changing the world. Even though you're an introvert, we can still see you like out there doing the talk, doing the walk. So thank you so much, Brie.
Thank you.